Now, I'm going to tell you a story, and if you're sitting comfortably, I will begin. It is called The Strange Tale of Mr Snoddy. There is a pretty place that not many people know about. You would have to look very hard on a map to find it. The postman knows where it is, and so does the man who comes to read the electricity and gas meters. There are even some old people living in towns who discovered it long ago, but they have kept it a secret. They don't want anyone else to know, in case they go and spoil it. Of course, the place I am talking about is Shingle Cove. Squeezed between towering cliffs, Shingle Cove is a little fisherman's village. Small cottages, painted in all different sorts of merry colours, are set close together in cobbled streets, higgledy-piggledy from the stony beach all the way up a narrow valley that finally opens up to small farms, the snorting of pigs, clucking of hens, and loud honking of geese. It is a very busy place where you'll see both young and old fishermen in dark blue jerseys, black Wellingtons, and bib and brace trousers, surrounded by lobster pots, oiled winches, and yellow marker buoys. Some are scraping and varnishing the hulls of upturned boats, while others sit on walls or empty fish barrels, mending piles of green net. Their wives never seem to have a minute to spare. Lines of washing blow wildly in the salt sea breeze, parlours are swept clean, and the smell of fish pie fills the air at lunchtime. In such a small place, everyone knows each other. In fact, it is very difficult to go down a street without stopping to talk to a friend, an uncle, an aunt, the baker, the grocer, or some small child sitting in a pram. You could never imagine anyone feeling lonely here, because there are always different noises to remind you that something is going on. There is a hubbub in the pub, excited shouts coming from the schoolroom, a hammer banging, a diesel chugging, the crashing of waves, and, way up high, the raucous screech of seagulls. I wish I could say that, without exception, everyone in the village was happy, but I'm afraid this was not the case. There is a very small cottage, perhaps the smallest cottage in the village, that looks very sad. It is not painted like all the others, where yellows, pinks, bright blues, and shades of green entertain the eye. No, this cottage is plain grey, the colour of the bare stone from which it is made. Anyone visiting would be excused for thinking that nobody could possibly live there, because the windows are dirty, they don't have curtains, and the small garden at the back is covered in tall weeds. However, if you were very patient and kept looking, you might at some stage see a shadow cross from behind the window, or notice the back door open ever so slightly for something to be thrown out. Yes, there was someone living in the little grey cottage, and his name was Mr Snoddy. Mr Horace Snoddy had lived in the cottage all his life, and was now 34 years of age. For many years he had been looked after by his mother. She was a very kind lady who kept him well fed and properly clothed. She also made sure that he behaved properly at all times, was never lazy, and said his prayers each evening before going to bed. Mr Snoddy could not remember his father. It was a mystery to everyone that on Horace's 2nd birthday he marched out of the house and never came back. Some said he had walked into the sea. Some thought he had gone to prison, and there were those who whispered that he had another wife and that he was now living in Ireland with her. As a result, Mr Snoddy's poor mother always had to labour extremely hard to make sure she had enough money to buy food. Sadly, she passed away when still quite young. Mr Snoddy was only 21 years old when this happened, with some saying the poor lady had simply died from overwork. Losing his wonderful mother was a great blow to Mr Snoddy. People in the street said how sorry they were for him, and asked if he needed any help. Mr Snoddy never answered, simply rushing away in silence to the refuge of his little cottage. He missed his mother, and at night time, when the streets were dark and no one was about, he would sometimes venture out quickly, climbing the cobbled street, up the hill to the small chapel just outside the village. Picking wild flowers in the gloom, he would gather a small bunch, and when satisfied he had enough, would make his way through the chapel gate to his mother's grave. There he would sit, placing the flowers in the little porcelain jug that once contained his breakfast milk. As the years went by, Mr Snoddy got thinner and thinner. His mother had never taught him to cook, and so he lived for most of the time on baked beans, bread, milk, and cheese. As a small boy, his mother made sure he looked quite smart, but now his hair had grown long and tousled because she was no longer there to cut it. What is more, his clothes were in a dreadful state. There were holes in his jacket, tears in his trousers, his toes peeped through his socks, and his jumper was now used as a wiping-up cloth. Now these things were very bad, but there was worse to come. He hardly ever went out. The sun never shone on him, and when everybody else was nice and brown, his face stayed white as chalk. Well, most of his face, that is. The one exception was his nose. It was a very long, thin nose, but unlike the rest of his face, it was bright red, and that is because it was constantly dribbling. In winter he always had a cold, and in spring and summer he had the most awful hay fever. Throughout the year he was either coughing or he was sneezing. He coughed and sneezed so regularly that when his gungy nose filled up, he would wipe it on his sleeve or blow it on the edge of his grubby tablecloth. Some people had noticed what he did with his nose, and made sure that if he touched anything of theirs, they would go and clean it thoroughly. In fact, if a saucepan had a slimy handle, they would say, "Oh, Mr Snoddy has been here." If they sat in a comfortable chair and the armrest was sticky, they would say, "Oh, Mr Snoddy has been here." Even if someone picked up a cup and saw something green and dripping on it, they would still say, "Mr Snoddy's been here." Sadly, when school children heard about this, they no longer called him Mr Snoddy. "There goes dirty Mr Snotty," they would shout if ever they saw him in the street, and some even threw small pebbles at him. It is true Mr Snoddy's affliction was pretty disgusting, but it was not his only problem. Mr Snoddy had never had a refrigerator in his cottage. It would have cost him far too much. Instead, he put his bread, his cheese, milk, and opened cans of baked beans in a large wardrobe next to all his ragged clothes. Some of this food stayed in there for weeks. The bread became stale with grey mould, the cheese had furry fungus growing on it, the milk turned into curdled lumps, and a truly vile smell drifted from the cans of baked beans. Now you would think Mr Snoddy would immediately get rid of all this horrible stuff, but he never did. His mother had told him it was wrong to throw away good food. In any case, he was too poor to do anything like that. Instead, he simply ate it. Now you can imagine what all that rotten food did to Mr Snoddy's tummy. It was a disaster. He always seemed to have a tummy ache, and with the tummy ache came some really horrendous smells. It also meant he had to spend a lot of time in the toilet. As a result, people sometimes noticed him searching in their bins. He was looking for paper, and when he found it, he would take it home, cut it up into neat squares, punch a hole through it, and hang it on a hook next to his loo. It was very boring having to sit on the toilet for so long, so sometimes he would take a sandwich with him, or even some old socks that needed mending. He always found something to do while seated, even ripping off bits of his special loo paper to see what writing they contained. Indeed, he became quite knowledgeable from all the facts and scraps of news they revealed. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking Mr. Snoddy was a totally useless person. In some ways you would be right, but not in all. There was one thing at which he excelled. Indeed, he was brilliant. He could make all sorts of things from any old bits of wood he found. He carved exquisite little toys, figurines, and ornaments. He made cradles, small tables, rocking chairs, stools, and wheelbarrows. Indeed, so long as it was made of wood, it seemed he could create almost anything, and in a way that gave people the utmost pleasure. When people discovered his talent, they did their best to overcome their disgust of his dribbling nose and horrible smells, sometimes knocking on his door to see if they could buy something. Mr. Snoddy's talent with wood did give him some pleasure, but there was an even greater one which set him to painful longing. Each morning a pretty lady called Marigold passed his cottage, taking her 2 young children to school. Unbeknown to her, Mr. Snoddy viewed her from behind his dirty front window. In the afternoon he did the same when school was finished and Marigold came by after collecting her children. Marigold was a very hard-working lady, just the same as Mr. Snoddy's mother had been. Marigold's husband had been a fisherman, and one night had gone out in his boat to fish on the black, storm-swollen sea. She had pleaded with him not to go, but they were poor, and if he didn't fish, they would not have enough money to feed themselves. Marigold's husband did not return that night, or the next day. Instead, just 1 week later, the wreckage of his boat was found, smashed on the beach, some way further up the coast. Marigold was now alone, solely responsible for bringing up her 2 children, a young girl and boy called Susie and Sam. Mr. Snoddy knew about Marigold's loss and felt very sad for her. He felt sad in the same way as when he had lost his own mother. He wanted so much to know Marigold, to show his concern and even his affection, but he was far too shy to do so. People laughed at him, they avoided him. He could not possibly present himself to Marigold. He would simply continue to look at her lovingly, hidden from view as she passed his cottage each day. At least, he thought he was hidden from view. One morning as Marigold passed by, she thought she saw a movement behind the front window of Mr. Snoddy's cottage. She looked closer, but now could see nothing. Just in case there was something there, she gave a little wave, and then walked jauntily on. Mr. Snoddy had seen the wave, and was totally dumbstruck. He was even more baffled and surprised when Marigold did the same thing the next day, only this time she gave a little smile as well. For the first time in many months Mr. Snoddy was so happy, he thought he should do something about it. That night he crept out to walk rapidly along the street until he came to what he thought must be Marigold's front door. There he bent down and placed 2 little wooden carvings on the step. One was a tiny doll, the other a racing car. Then he turned and raced back home, hoping nobody had seen him. Next day, when Marigold passed by, she stopped in the street and turned towards Mr. Snoddy's cottage. Then something extraordinary happened. This time both her children joined in waving at the cottage. That night, once again Mr. Snoddy made his way down the street, this time taking some delicately carved flowers he had made out of soft pine wood. Once again, the following morning, he was rewarded with waves and smiles. He even had the courage to come closer to the window and to wave back. Later that day, Mr. Snoddy decided he would go to the beach and shoreline to look for driftwood. When he opened his front door, he almost tripped over a small package wrapped in brown paper and string. He picked it up, took it indoors and put it on the table. He looked at it for a few moments, wondering what on earth it could be. He decided to open it, and when he did, he had the surprise of his life. It was the fruitiest cherry cake he had ever seen, and it smelt delicious. He immediately got out a knife, cut a slice, and gobbled it down. It was fantastic, and such a change from the mouldy bread and cheese he had had for breakfast. That night Mr. Snoddy made yet another trip down the street to Marigold's front door. This time he took a small rocking chair. It was just the size that would fit a young child. Next day the waves and smiles from the street and from inside the house were even more vigorous. Then, over the next week, strange things began to happen. One day Mr. Snoddy washed his trousers and put them on the clothesline in his garden. When he thought they were dry, he went out to collect them. Unpegging them, he noticed they had been ironed, and on closer inspection, he saw that all the tears were no longer there. They had been mended. On another day, he found the socks he had just washed had lost all their holes. Someone had neatly darned them. Then, coming back from the beach one afternoon, he could hardly recognize his back garden. All the weeds had gone, and new borders had been dug, ready for flowers to be planted. There was nothing for it. Mr. Snoddy knew exactly who had been doing all these kind things. Putting on the least scruffy of his clothes, he determined to go and knock on Marigold's front door to thank her. He had never done this sort of thing before, and when he was halfway down the street, his shyness started to slow him down. Standing in front of Marigold's cottage for at least 4 minutes, he found it impossible to knock on the door. He was about to turn and hurry home when suddenly the door opened, and Marigold was standing there with a big smile. "Hello, Horace," she said in the sweetest way you could ever imagine. Mr. Snoddy wondered if he was in a dream. Nobody had called him Horace since his mother had died, and now it sounded so wonderful and caring. "Would you like to come in and have a cup of tea?" Horace was lost for words. He wanted so much to say yes, but his nose was running, and even he had to admit he was rather stinky. "I was thinking we could have it in the garden," Marigold suggested diplomatically. Mumbling a happy yes, Horace followed Marigold around the side of the cottage to her small garden, where there was a bench and a small table. For Horace, it was the happiest cup of tea he had had in his whole life. Over the coming weeks, Horace and Marigold saw much of each other. Horace spent time doing lots of carpentry and mending jobs in Marigold's cottage. He fixed the roof, replaced floorboards, stopped taps from dripping, and did lots of decorating. Marigold, meanwhile, put a huge effort into cleaning Horace's cottage. The floors were cleared of wood shavings, the horrible tablecloth was thoroughly washed, the wardrobe was sorted out, and his windows now shone, newly clothed with pretty little curtains. She also made sure he had good fresh food to eat. She even brought him a large brown plastic bottle with a printed label that boldly indicated Vitamin C. Horace was instructed to take 1 pill a day, and within 2 weeks his nose no longer dribbled and had changed to a healthy bronze colour, now like the rest of his face, because he had been spending a lot of time outside in the summer sun. Something else was happening. He was no longer smelly, his tummy no longer ached, and the loo was now empty for most of the day. His hair had been neatly cut, he had put on weight, and seemed to be so much healthier. Marigold even thought he was rather handsome, and regretted when the time came each day for them to return to their own cottages. One day, seeing how well Horace played with Sam and Susie, she thought how nice it would be if there was no longer any parting each day. Of course, you can imagine what happened next. Marigold married her Horace. She had a new husband, and her children had a new father. Horace moved into his wife's cottage, but he didn't sell his own. Instead, he turned it into a proper carpenter's workshop. He painted it a rich golden orange, the same colour as marigold flowers, and then put a little sign outside which had on it, "Horace and Marigold, Bespoke Woodworking." And it wasn't long before their fame stretched far and wide. They were no longer poor. In the years to come, Marigold had another baby, young Sam became apprentice to Horace, and Susie had more wooden dolls than any girl in the small village of Shingle Cove. Well, that's the end of our little story. Johnny Pop wrote it specially for you. I hope you enjoyed it. Wasn't it nice that Horace and Marigold found each other and could live happily ever after? Bye-bye.